The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website. That's newthinkingaloud.org. You can even order a printed copy from nta-magazine.magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emmy Vadnais, co-host with Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is art and the invisible world of parapsychology. My guest is Shannon Taggart, who is an artist and author of the book Seance, that documents historical and artistic photos of spiritualism. Shannon has been interviewed a previous time on New Thinking Aloud with Jeffrey Mishlove, and I'm going to link to that interview in the upper right corner of your screen. It's called A Photographer Among the Spirits. Shannon is joining me today in person as we're both located in St. Paul, Minnesota. Now I'll switch over to that video. Welcome, Shannon. It's such a joy to have you with me in person today on New Thinking Aloud.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
We both know that art and parapsychology is a really big topic, and you have spent the last 20 or so years photographing spiritualists. So we're going to be talking more about the last maybe 100 years or so of modern and maybe contemporary art.
Yes. Through my project on spiritualism and photographing spiritualism, I never saw the two topics related, but the further I worked and the longer my project became, I realized how inextricably linked photography and spiritualism are. They both were invented around the same time of the 18th century. There's locational synchronicities. Photography freezes time and, we can look at the past with it. Spiritualists try to speak with people who are no longer here. There's my book kind of focuses on a lot of these interconnections between the two. But then through the work, I realized how parapsychology, the material culture of parapsychology, meaning the images and the devices and the documentation that has happened through the practice of studying the mind and the invisible forces at work in parapsychology, that it created this very unique material culture that I see very much as its own visionary art. And I'm very interested in kind of like the material that has been discarded or thrown away by parapsychology, meaning that, the images that were supposed to be used as proof, and such. I'm kind of thinking that the artist has a real, ability to say something using these materials.
Mm-hmm. How does one photograph or document through art the invisible world?
So that's a topic that I was immediately confronted with when I tried to photograph mediumship and spiritualists. I constantly was questioning, how do you photograph invisible things? How do you make a picture about a visible body speaking to an invisible presence? And my technique that I developed over time was using playing with time and playing with mistakes or things that I didn't intend to give me a language to speak for the invisible. And at first, when I was making exposures, longer exposures, it was due out of necessity because I was in a lot of dark room situations. But I was having these uncanny synchronicities between the invisible experience and what was coming through in my camera. And both skeptics and believers were confused by my process. Like, spiritualists, all of their art is an endeavor with evidence and trying to prove that, they're seeking evidence of their proof of contact, or, there's a lot of focus on merging religion and science and kind of proving that we can have contact with the dead and contact with the other side. And then the skeptics would say this doesn't mean anything. It's just a blurry picture. But I was having these strong synchronicities with some of the pictures. And also I started to realize that one of the primary hallmarks of a paranormal experience is that time and space becomes irrelevant or different or changed. And I thought about how, when we photograph marathon runners, we really abstract time to a very short window of time that our eyes never see. And so, thinking about the space-time continuum and how we perceive time in a straight line, it doesn't really work in the way that we perceive it. This is getting very conceptual, but I really thought that the synchronicities I was getting were speaking to some truth about the experience.
Mm-hmm. And what was the truth you found?
That these experiences have a complicated relationship with truth, just as photography does. And one of the biggest compliments I've received from my work, and the photographs published in my book, was many mediums have contacted me and expressed thanks that I was able to speak to the reality of their experience in a way that is not done in words or not done in scientific study. And I started to think about, the truth of the laboratory, the truth of the repeatable truth of the laboratory is very different than the truth of the artist or the truth of art. And that, there's an emotional truth in art that we acknowledge. And so how this other type of truth could play into parapsychology, and is there another truth in these artifacts that people, have disregarded because of their lack of scientific truth?
You spent many years you've traveled around the world, but you spent many years in Lilydale, New York, which is a spirituals community, and your recognition of the similarities between photography and spiritualism is really echoed in that they grew up right down the street from each other, with Kodak being right down the street.
Yes. So when I began my project at Lilydale, I was a photographer. I was working as a professional photographer. I had studied photography in college, and I had no idea that spiritualism had this very deep and profound connection with the medium of photography. I'd like to say that spiritualism is the first religion to use the new medium of photography as to make an iconography. Previously that had only been done in painting. And also there's the first seances that ever happened in Rochester, New York, at a place called Corinthian Hall that's no longer there, but it was located literally down the block from where Kodak's headquarters are. So there's a synchronicity that the exact same area and the exact same city introduced both spiritualism and photography into popular culture. It brought it to the masses.
Mm-hmm. Art has been helping to represent what's going on inside of an individual, the consciousness, imagery that we can't always put into words. And I think that in more the modern era with photography, the tricky part is that sometimes people will look at these photographs and just think they look fake.
Spirit photography, one of its most distinctive qualities is that it represents a thing in its opposite. It demonstrates what the mystic is saying is happening, and it also negates it by making it seem fake or fraudulent. Like a lot of the early spirit photographs, they look like double exposures. Some tables that are flying might look like they're held up by string. There's an absurdity and a true, they almost seem like pranks, or they come across that way. They come across in a very silly, unserious way, yet they reenact the reality that is being claimed that is actually happening. And this flickering is something that makes them so interesting. I think that's, the art world is now re-looking at spiritualist art and photography. And that's been represented in some of the most major museums and art shows that have recently been happening. I think it's about the novelty and also the paradox. They're almost like they make you meditate on the topic. And these have been discounted by parapsychologists or even by spiritualists. A lot of spiritualists are uncomfortable with the history of spirit photography because it failed in convincing everybody that these were true images. It failed proving spirits through photographs. Mm-hmm. And but I see them as a very very complicated objects that speak to a lot of the issues at play. We also don't understand the role that fraud and deception plays in parapsychology, in mediumship. I mean, the whole history is wrought with, people who are caught cheating or accused of cheating or put in situations where they were forced not to cheat. And, it speaks to the topic in a very interesting way.
Yeah, it seems that we as humans are ever searching, or many humans are ever searching for proof of the unseen world or the spiritual.
Yes. And these topics are incredibly difficult to prove, as parapsychologists know. And I think, parapsychology is a very unique science because you're dealing with a phenomena that is deeply attached to human emotions and meaning and a subjective reality overlapping an objective reality. And so, for example, one of my heroes in the whole history of parapsychology is the medium Eileen Garrett. Mm. And she was a medium herself, but she built a whole foundation to try and scientifically study her own mediumistic gifts, which she did not understand, and she couldn't classify, she couldn't explain. But she also started a literary press, to also look at it through literature. And she called for like a multidisciplinary approach to studying these things, and not just with science, but with art, with literature, looking at the history of magic, mm-hmm. looking at neuroscience, looking at dream research, kind of using this multifaceted way to understand this this topic that's very deeply connected to the human experience and the deepest questions that we have about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. And yet there have been many parapsychological scientific studies that have shown that there definitely is something going on here.
Yes. And, J.B. Ryan statistically proved ESP exists, but yet it's not acknowledged, or it's not part of, when you talk to somebody about these topics, the average person would say, well, science would have proved it if it was true. There's still something about it that is unacceptable. You and I had spoken, and you mentioned how you've talked to scientists who have said, the criteria for how they're judging parapsychology evidence is much higher than how they do in other studies.
Yeah, I just spoke with Mona Sobhani, who's a neuroscientist, who said that when she was exploring it, that she found just that the methods used in the research studies of parapsychology are often even more rigorous than other fields of science.
Right. So what do we do with that? And I think that the art that is related to these topics speaks to a mythical reality. And myth is a way of acknowledging truth in the world it's often defined as fiction that is true, and myth outlasts science. Myths last for thousands of years. Scientific theories only stay around for a few hundred. So, we need to acknowledge this mythical reality that is in the art of parapsychology. And that's kind of the way I look at it. And we allow literature I think pretty much materialists would agree that literature is one of the things humans use to grapple with the complexity of life. And we acknowledge that there is a truth in it. And so how does parapsychological material relate to this idea? And, when I look at the history of parapsychology, I think of all the iconic symbols that have come out of it, like the Ouija board planchette, the bent spoon, the Zener cards even, they make the imagination go wild. Skeptics use them just as much to argue their points as the believers do. Flying tables, all of these things that also, too, they make the familiar strange. They confront us with ideas that reality might not be exactly as our senses perceive it. And in the 19th century, we also learned that to believe that our senses were the only way to get knowledge became unscientific. With the realization that there was radioactivity, that, electricity, the way electricity worked, atomic theory, the communication with the telephone or the radio or the telegraph.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioning that myth has survived for so long that I think it speaks to our inner selves and those archetypes of who we are. But just to bring it back to your own photography, when you were with those mediums, one thing that struck me when reading your book is that you mentioned that some of the people who would be in a reading or a sitting or a seance, whatever the term is, that they would see, for example, maybe ectoplasm or something appear that was physical in the room. But yet when it was photographed, it would sometimes be portrayed differently. Like maybe some of the ones that had the ectoplasm in there with some images, they looked sort of cartoonish. But then the people in the room said that doesn't seem to really represent what was happening in that moment in time in reality.
Yeah, the photographic reality kind of negated it or betrayed it. And
so interesting.
So that's why one of the first people to photograph ectoplasm, Shrek Notzing, he stopped using photography and started just relying on human testimony. But yeah, it speaks to this thing, like this flickering, this true false thing. It's almost like, a Zen koan or something. And when I say that we don't really understand how fraud works, or even the fraud seems to be prevalent. I mean, we don't understand how placebo works either. And that's one of the big mysteries of science, is how the placebo works. And, I don't know. I mean, I'm just riffing here, but just this, we really don't understand what deception and fraud, what the role actually plays. Carl Jung, argued that maybe the natural progression of any kind of period of psychic study would be fraud or deception in order to get the attention away from it, so consensus reality could reign again, or kind of like a restart or a cleansing aspect. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the placebo effect, and it's something that I've actually looked into and studied a fair amount, and it seems that belief plays a significant role in how a person responds to something, whether they expect that it will help them or if they expect that it won't help them. It's usually consistent with what their expectations are and beliefs are around if it's an inert substance like some type of pill or some type of experience as well. And it seems that what we believe is really can indicate how our life functions overall in general.
Yeah, definitely. And in parapsychology, there was even a placebo experiment trying to bring about ghosts. It was called the Philip experiment in the 70s, and it was psychologists who got together and they say, we're going to invent this ghost and we're going to sit together. They made his whole life story. They would sit together in a circle and they would concentrate on invoking this fake ghost, this ghost that they invented, but they started to get very real phenomena. And it's documented in a book called Conjuring Philip.
Wow. What do you make of that?
Again, it gets to this, like, what makes this stuff so interesting.
Yeah.
We don't really understand the role of performance or acting or reenactment or fraud or deception. Like, all of these things kind of blur in these practices. And this is, in shamanism, in our culture, all of these connections between the true and the false are very pulled apart. But in shamanism, a successful shaman performs the act, like the successful act is the illusion. And there wasn't a criteria of true and false as much, like as you see with shamanic healing, things like psychic surgery.
Mm-hmm. Well, and meaning seems to also impact a person's experience as well, and how they might either perceive or maybe even intend for something to occur.
Right. We don't understand what's being activated deep inside ourselves when we see an illusion.
But you yourself have been in those spaces, and you've been around a lot of mediums and spiritualists, and you've seen ectoplasm up close and personal. So what is your takeaway from some of those experiences as to what is occurring?
Yeah, it's a very complicated topic within spiritualism, the idea of ectoplasm, which is this physical substance that's supposed to merge the realms of life and death. It's a substance that emanates in the seance room, largely from the bottom of the body of the medium, and takes form, makes materializations, shows images. And for my book, I spent time with the most controversial medium who's working today, a man named Kai Mugi from Germany. And he's been studied by parapsychologists such as Stephen Brody. When I went to his seances, it was like seeing these vintage photographs jump to life right before my eyes. And I asked Kai, why do you do this? Why do you go around doing these ectoplasmic seances? And he says, the first reason is for healing, that there's a healing that comes about by simply trying to merge the realms of life and death, or, this world and the next. And then he said, the second reason is to get people out of their own heads. And he said, I'm not trying to prove anything to anybody. I am just happy if at least they have one thought out of their normal thought pattern in our seances. And he's a really fascinating person to talk to. He documents his own seances. He has a blog online where you can see images and videos and all sorts of things that he's done of his work over the years. And he and I have talked about the strangeness and the absolute bizarre quality of some of these images. And he says that there's something in the bizarreness that is necessary because it gets to or is able to open up something in the viewer that otherwise can't be accessed.
Yeah. It seems that some people are looking for more evidence or physical proof, and others are very happy with maybe the messages verbally they receive, or maybe their own communication with, for example, a deceased loved one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my book, it's all about spiritualism, and I have to be careful to say that there's a lot of disagreement within spiritualism about whether these practices are really relevant to us anymore. There are mediums who believe we need to move on from these darkroom seances and trying to produce ectoplasm, and we need to focus on evolving consciousness. And then they focus, very much what you'll see in spiritualism is like what you see in the popular TV shows like the Long Island Medium. It's like what we're doing here today. We're in a room that's lit and we're just having a conversation. That's what a lot of modern mediumship actually is. But there are people within the movement who say, no, this has been with us since the very beginning. The very first mediumship was physical mediumship, and that there's something necessary about going into a dark room and turning your senses off and seeing and bringing forth evidence in that way. Mm-hmm. So, and spiritualists are just by nature free thinkers, so that you have a lot of, and then you have, all along the way, a lot of different opinions, and different ways of looking at it, even other than those two ways.
I admire your neutrality that you bring to the topic.
Yeah, that was really difficult because there is, so many people that I love and respect who are mediums work in very different ways.
Yeah, it's true. Everybody's got a different style. And really, I think a lot of them have their own gifts.
Yeah, and they have their own way of doing it. And also early on, as I was working with my project, people would write to me or call me and say, hey, can you refer me to a medium? Mm-hmm. And early on, I used to do it. And then sometimes it didn't work out. And then there'd be sometimes where somebody would have a session with a medium I did not think was particularly talented. And they would tell me these amazing stories. And so I started to I think maybe something, about human chemistry and also timing has something to do with why a reading works and why it doesn't. Mm-hmm. I myself, I've had a lot of readings, and some of them I'll be sitting with the medium and think, none of this is making sense. And then I had one reading with, a medium who I was particularly impressed by. And so I booked a reading, and then the information I got really didn't make sense to me, but it did make sense 5 years later. And that was really shocking. And I guess that's why a lot of mediums record their readings so that you have it for posterity. And I was really amazed. One of my favorite mediums in Lilydale is a woman named Gretchen Clark. And she was one of the first mediums who allowed me to photograph her. And when I went and photographed, sat in, she allowed me to sit on readings. And I sat in on one of her readings, and I saw her, she gave all this information about, a horse, a brother that didn't exist, a property, this, that, tons of rich detail. And the people sat there and said, no. And then she just closed her eyes and asked again. And she said, no, that's what I have for you. And she just left it at that. And they left kind of confused, and she was fine. And so then I followed up with the people, and like 2 weeks later, they did all this family research, and they found out every single thing she said was true. And it revealed this story about their families that they didn't even know. And so when I saw Gretchen, I said, Gretchen, those people who were here for the reading, did you know that they went back and they found all this? And she's like, oh, that's really nice, but I don't need that. Like she was so certain, and she trusted her process and her practice so much that it didn't matter that she said it was nice, but it didn't really, she didn't need that for her to do her work. And I was really taken with that. I thought that was very powerful. It was really interesting to me early on because when I started, I didn't really understand much about any of these topics.
Yeah, she was so certain of her own abilities that she didn't really need that validation.
Yeah, and early on, one of the most surprising things to me was finding out that you could study mediumship. When I first started, I thought, oh, people are just born with this and then they just do it, or, they're just, there are development things called development courses. And a very interesting thing I saw was, I was at the Arthur Findlay College, which is a learning center for spiritualists in England, and people will come all over the world, not speak the same language, and be able to connect on this way they worked with their consciousness. And when you see people who don't know each other, who are from completely different cultures, talk about a mechanism that's deep at work inside of themselves, it's hard not to acknowledge the authenticity. I don't know how you fake that. And they were able to help each other and teach each other despite the barriers of culture and language.
I think what you say about timing and people connecting with the right person at the right time, or them having their own experiences, can really help with the doubting mind. I've, in my practices with intuition, one of the key tenets is that if you doubt it, you're going to block it. And so when people are questioning, by all means, we need to, if people are making claims that they are, faking, that's something to acknowledge. But I think it seems that many people are quite genuine and authentic, and that if we can open our minds to the possibilities, that actually, I think there's even research. I got to talk to Bernard Beitman, who has been researching meaningful coincidences and synchronicities, and the more that we believe in that and allow for that and talk about that, the more that those occurrences actually happen.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Did you have any synchronicities when you've been looking into art and parapsychology?
Yeah, I feel like my whole process and my whole journey with this topic has been a series of synchronicities and events that led me to where I needed to go. And it's funny because my first days in Lilydale, the mediums would say, "Oh, you're here for, you'll find out, or you'll see." And like I said early on, I had no idea. I didn't even understand how you could be a sane person and still be talking with dead people. I just didn't understand it because I had never, but I was meeting all these wonderful, lovely people who obvious to me that they were having, they had an authentic practice and that they were called to the work. And that's, one of the stereotypes that is out there, I think, is that, anybody who's involved in mediumship or spiritualism is a fraud who wants to get money off of people. And I was immediately confronted with that as not being what was happening in Lilydale and not the reality of the people I was meeting. I felt like it was spiritual work that they were called to, and they weren't making crazy amounts of money at all. And another stereotype that my work is about, all of my interests concerning spiritualism and parapsychology and art, is that there's a stereotype that this is for dumb people, or it's anti-intellectual, or you're gullible or something. But digging into the history, the most amazing minds of the 19th and 20th century were involved with these topics. It's deeply tied to almost every innovation of the late 19th century. Madame Curie sat in seances and investigated them, her and her husband Pierre, and she won the Nobel Prize. There was a series of Nobel Prize winners you can find in mathematicians, Thomas Edison, Abraham Lincoln and his wife held seances. So, and these details were written out of many of the histories that I studied from. And, so I'm really interested in how spiritualism and mediumship and ESP or psychokinetic energy relates to innovation and new things that we bring into the world. It seems to me to be everywhere, and that, in fact, some of the most important intellectuals find that rational thought only takes them so far, and that they are absolutely confronted with these topics and need to explore them.
Several innovations and inventions have occurred with people getting insights through dreams.
Yes. Yeah, the whole dream thing is fascinating also. And the connection to the dream state, or that level of consciousness, and how that plays into all of these topics.
How does art have the ability to tell the truth that science cannot?
Art speaks to the emotional truth that is at work, and it also helps tell the story of these topics and how they relate to meaning, and they connect with meaning.
They bring in images, right?
Yes. And the images help tell the story. They help tell the truth of the ideas. They help tell the truth of the experience, and they help spread the ideas and the interest, and they create conversation. They draw people in a way that scientific study does not. One of my favorite things about parapsychology is there's history of colorful characters and all the really quirky devices, like the cabinets that they build for mediums, like Houdini's cabinet that he put the medium Marjorie in to test her, or like the artist Susan McWilliam in Ireland. She has a breadth and depth of work all about the laboratory as kind of similar to the artist's studio, and the blindfolds that are used, or the fingertip perception studies, or, the boxes and weights and chains that are put around mediums' feet. When you see these devices at work, you see that parapsychology is, really, there's an absurdity to these devices, and it's almost like related to the absurdity of the question, can we really know these things? And there's like a playful, theatrical element to parapsychology that you can find understanding in by looking at the material culture.
Well, and some of those devices do look sort of strange out of context, but when you really explore what they were used for and how they aided a process, that, maybe they aren't, that's so strange after all, just like beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah. So, I think that the, image factory of parapsychology has inspired a lot of my favorite artists, like Tony Orsler and the artist Brian Catling, he just passed, but, he was in England. And Tony Orsler is a media artist here in the United States, and he has a huge collection of parapsychology material, and his art is very much inspired by all of this, the whole image factory of how we study these things and what they say about perception and human experience and entertainment and illusion. And I feel that artists really are tuned in to aspects of parapsychology that have kind of been lost or forgotten or overlooked. And artists also can create a positive attention towards these topics, which is very much needed. I understand why parapsychology hasn't fully embraced its artistic heritage, or it's not really integrated, because art is very interpretive and subjective, and parapsychology has had to struggle to be taken seriously, and to be taken seriously had to be very precise and very objective, and almost cleanse out anything that seems entertaining or subjective or silly, or it has this demand to be even more buttoned up than regular science, because it's making such broad claims.
While there are those images that are from experiments, shall we say, or experiences that people have had through parapsychology, you've also discovered that there are many artists who maybe wouldn't consider themselves to be mediums or even be in the field of parapsychology, who are getting major exhibitions and who have been active really throughout art history, who are now getting more attention.
There's exciting attention happening for mediumistic art and visionary art related to spiritualism and, related to the study of parapsychology. For example, the Swedish artist Hilma af Klint is now being acknowledged as a pioneer of abstract painting, and she was unknown in her life and was a medium who said that spirits were physically guiding her hand, and then later she worked in a different way where they were using her consciousness. And there was a recently exhibition of her work at the Guggenheim Museum in 2019 that was the best selling catalog and the most attended exhibition the museum has ever had. Last year at the Venice Biennale, Milk of Dreams exhibition, which is the Venice Biennale is one of the biggest art events in the world. There was a pavilion of seance photography. And recently here in Minneapolis, there was the Supernatural America exhibition, which dealt with all sorts of art about UFO, about mediumship, about magic. And so there is like a newfound openness and interest in these topics, and especially art that was made through with the help of spirits, or that the practitioners said was made with the help of spirits. And people are more open or fascinated or interested in these this form of art.
Yeah. Throughout history, and when people experience major loss, transition, grief, or there's a lot of discomfort going on in society and culture, people can turn toward looking to the spiritual realm. And it seems that that was sort of what was happening around the turn of the century, going into the 20th century. And also with our recent pandemic, do you think that that was also somehow impacting this occurring?
Yes, I think our culture is definitely in a time of transition, and there's a lot of anxiety, and also there's a lot of, we're questioning gender roles, we're questioning what is truth in science, how do we know the truth in science, how do you control a story, or whoever gets to control the story controls the narrative, or like people battling with different narratives and different ways of seeing reality, different ways of knowing the truth. All of these things are like brewing up really big in our culture. And so in times of transition, the book, George P. Hansen's book, The Trickster and the Paranormal, notes that in times of transition, these topics kind of reemerge and reappear. And also we're questioning histories that have been written. Part of the reason that Hilma af Klint and other artists like her that predate Kandinsky, such as Georgiana Houghton, part of that reason is because people are relooking at women's histories and the role that women played in culture. And spiritualism itself played a huge role in women getting the right to vote. It's the reason that, women were accepted as public speakers in America. And these histories are just recently being acknowledged. There's a book called Radical Spirits about feminism and spiritualism, and the author, Anne Brody, said that some of her colleagues in academia had questioned why she would want to taint the topic of women's rights with mediumship and spiritualism. And she said she had to because it's historically accurate.
What is the connection between the feminist movement and the suffragette and spiritualism?
When spiritualism started, it's actually erupted in an area of upstate New York, which became known as the Burned Over District, which is an area where Mormonism also started, spiritualism started, Seventh-day Adventism, but it's also where the women's rights movement started. It's a hotbed of radical activity. And so the women's rights movement was kind of up and coming right around the time that spiritualism was. And it's very interesting because the first public speakers were trans speakers. At that time, women were not allowed, or it was dangerous for women to speak in public. And the first time people may have seen women speaking in public was these entranced mediums. And the spiritualists would allow women to speak on their platforms, as themselves. Mm-hmm. Susan B. Anthony used to speak at Lilydale. She would go. I mean, it was very much a tool. Spiritualism became a cultural force that aligned with the women's rights movement and helped women achieve equality. Spiritualism was a radical religion because it placed men and women as equals.
Mm. So they were very valued for their skills, and the men allowed them to be on the platforms with them.
Yeah, so it's interesting that women were able to use this idea of speaking as a spirit and not speaking as themselves in order to take that power and then keep that power. It was as if they used the spirit world to flip the script. And again, you're seeing spiritualism relate to innovation. And spiritualism is also related to abolitionism, holistic medicine, child's rights, marriage rights. It played a role in progressive politics in a very huge way.
Spirits literally gave women their voice.
Yep.
Oh, I love that. Are there any other artists in the last 100 years who you want to highlight?
The new project that I've been working on directly relates to this topic. I have recently, I've been working with the sociologist Jim McLennan, and he for a number of years studied a group known as the SORRAT Group, which is the Society for Research on Rapport and Telekinesis, which was started by the famous American poet John G. Neihart. And it was a seance group or a parapsychology group. They were advised by J.B. Rhine, and they were seeking to scientifically prove psychokinetic phenomena. But in the process, they created thousands of images. They created films, audio, a massive media archive that what they used as testimony to their experience. They also had a lot of spirit writing, and they took very precise notes. So with Jim, I've worked to save the archive of Tom and Elaine Richards, who were original members and the primary documentarians of the group. And so even though these materials were not acknowledged as art, at the time, I see them as prime examples of wonderful visionary art that was made as a byproduct of parapsychological study. Mm. And so I'm working on a book of this material, and I'm so excited, and I cannot wait until we get it out and share it, because it really speaks to almost everything we've touched on today in this interview in a very profound way. And a lot of it's never been seen before. And a lot of it was, especially the films were, completely maligned while the group was working. But Jim came to the realization that, he started out as a sociologist of science and studying parapsychology, and he switched to become a sociologist of religion because he realized it was more helpful to study the belief and the practices of what was going on rather than trying to prove it. He felt like sociology, a sociological study, was a really valid way of understanding these topics. And he started focusing on also the folklore of the group. And so he entered his study not trying to prove either way, but as an observer. And although he was interested in the proof, he also was interested in how it affected the people.
Did he find that it was just belief? Did he find that there was validity?
He thought, I'm going to go down there and study and prove that this is all just a big fraud. And he ended up finding out that it was much more complicated than that, and that many parapsychologists went there with the goal of showing that it was fraud, but then coming away with they weren't sure what was happening there. It's one of the most exotic cases in the history of parapsychology, and many well-known parapsychologists were involved with the group or interested in it or studied it, and many didn't even publish on it because it was unclear what was actually happening. Mm. There's a lot of, the films that they made look like obvious staged, hoaxed, stop motion films. But when you try to get down to the nitty gritty of how they actually did it, I had one parapsychologist tell me, it's just easier to believe that the spirits did it once you go down the rabbit hole with all the ways you would make it happen under the constraints. So the films kind of seem to be saying something else. They seem to be asking us to contemplate the topic. Mm. And if you look at them that way, they're really fascinating pieces of history.
Well, you said a mouthful there in relationship to this topic and art, because that's a lot of what art does for us. And I'm just going to link in the upper right corner here to that interview with Jim McLennan on the SORRAT Group.
For me, I think the SORRAT material is calling us to contemplation, and maybe some of this confusion, maybe that's part of the point. in the entity letters, Jim McLennan makes the analogy between the SORRAT films and other religious devices that mix shock and humor, such as like a Zen koan, and how, they're calling us to contemplate the mystery. They're calling us into the mystery. They're making us confront the mystery without getting an answer. And I love thinking of the material that SORRAT produced as having that dual purpose. And I think there's a lot there to unpack. And the SORRAT Group had always hoped that their efforts would be acknowledged by science or would help the history of parapsychology. They literally started with the premise that they were trying to bring truth from non-physical reality into our world so that it could help. They talked about psychokinetic force as being maybe as important to humankind as the invention of the wheel or bringing fire. They really felt it was that powerful and that important. And they were really trying to bring some of that knowledge into the world. And the story of the group, doesn't end well because they were maligned by many of the people who studied them. Yeah. But it's my hope that their materials, once they live on and are put forth into the world, that maybe there will be insights found, and that maybe part of this archive that we've saved will help with that.
Well, that's quite a tease. Are there any other images or imagery that you're willing to share from the SORRAT Group?
Yeah, I'd love to share a few of the images because I think the material is just so exciting. And as I'm going with the research, I occasionally share some images on my Instagram or on my Twitter. I also have a website, a mailing list as well, where I'll be sharing updates, and we're hoping the book will be out in 2024.
Sometimes people will take their own photographs, right? Smartphones are ubiquitous, and people will capture an orb, or there'll be some anomaly in their photograph. What do you make of those?
Oh, I love all the experimentation that's going on right now with all types of devices, and iPhones, certainly, video cameras, different apps. It's part of my research, actually, to pay attention to new forms of spirit photography that are emerging. And there's many mediums at work who are documenting themselves with their own cameras, who are pursuing orb photography, which I guess you could say orb photography is the spirit photography of today. And they're not really as concerned with what is making the orb, although there are claims that it's not dust or water or any kind of a glitch with a camera, that can be debated, but they're focused on how you can interact with an orb. Orb practitioners call the orbs in, make the room fill with orbs, make them move around in patterns, see if they can direct them with their minds. And a lot of the orb photography is really compelling and fascinating, actually. And it's also very playful, and, orbs can be really beautiful too. So I'm very interested in how people are experimenting, and I get really inspired by amateur photographers who are experimenting with these ideas and these topics. It's one of the most fun parts of my research.
Because you are a photographer and an expert in this area, do you feel that you have the ability to tell when a photograph is either, quote, fake or not?
I can pretty easily discern blatant manipulation, like such that happens in Photoshop or with double exposure. But for the most part, that's one of the mysteries of photography, is when you see it, you're not really sure how it was made. It's kind of completely abstracted from reality. It's a representation of reality. And that's part of what I love about photography. I also, although I didn't understand it early on, I realized that I've always been interested in the telepathic aspects of photography and how a photographer's consciousness is embedded in their photographs. We talk a lot about it. It's often called the photographer's eye, but you can tell by great when it's a great photographer, you can distinctively tell it's their image. And how do we do that? I mean, we're often using the same types of cameras. There's not really that much difference from a lot of the professional cameras, but there is a difference in the person utilizing it. So this gets into ideas about, consciousness and the observer, and how does the observer change reality. And so that's like very much a parapsychological topic, but I also see it as an aspect of what makes photography so mysterious and so magical.
Yeah, how our consciousness can interact with the camera.
Yeah. I'm really, I've been on photo shoots with other photographers, and we're all standing elbow to elbow with similar cameras, yet all of our pictures are so distinctively different. And I find that really fascinating. And the first photographer that I ever encountered, the first photographer that I encountered as an art photographer was Deanne Arbus. I saw her photographs when I was in photography class in high school, and I realized that I was somehow seeing into her mind, and that she was showing me things that I wouldn't be able to see, even if I was there with her. And so that I deeply understood that when I saw her images, and that's what made me interested in photography. And I think that absolutely relates to what I'm still interested in photography.
Art can represent our consciousness.
Yeah. And how we can talk about psychological space, how we can, space that we know that exists, but you don't necessarily see. And I think that's part of what photography addresses. Even though it's taking pictures of physical reality, it speaks to unseen realms.
How do you think art or the creative process can help someone tap into their own consciousness, intuition, or spirituality?
Well, one of the things I was very struck with is when I sat in on mediumship development classes is how freeing they were for my creative self, meaning that they teach you to take your imagination seriously, to break down certain barriers, to allow playfulness, to allow silliness, to allow play, to allow experimentation. These practices, I think, relate deeply to creativity and art, but also to psychic ability.
Mm-hmm. We're in St. Paul, Minnesota, and there's a very well-known avenue called Summit Avenue, full of mansions, and several of them have been known to have a history of be considered being haunted. I think some of those who might be listening may be wondering if you've ever attempted to capture a spirit on film, or have you ever felt you've captured a spirit on film?
I've never been to the houses on Summit Avenue, but I do find the idea of haunted spaces really fascinating. And in the book, there's two photographs in my book that run next to each other, and they're from haunted hallways, or hallways where I was told there was spirit activity. And I took long exposures, and I got really interesting pictures. And the mediums that I showed the pictures to, one of them said, "Oh, well, this really haunting and ghosts, and that relates to the Akashic record, which is this idea that everything that's ever been done, or every emotion, every feeling, every movement, everything is recorded on the etheric plane, and that somehow we can tap into it, and that haunted spaces kind of speak to this idea." And so I tried to make a picture of these spaces with this idea in mind.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on those who attempt to capture spirit activity or to capture spirits through art or photographs?
I've talked with a lot of people who experiment with haunted spaces, bringing cameras in, and a lot of times part of the folklore is that when you really see the manifestation, the camera freezes, it won't work. I met a woman who's a photographer. She's a professional photographer, and she said she was on an investigation. She absolutely saw an entity and tried to photograph it, and her camera just wouldn't take the picture. And I hear this story over and over again. Anecdotally, you see it in the literature. The pictures that do happen that people claim are spirits, there's always this way of, yeah, but it could just be this, or yeah, but it could just be that. And this flickering of it might not be true. I don't know if that's, a way that's the only way we're supposed to have it, is if there's some doubt. I don't know. But anytime there's ever been like absolutely a full manifestation, people have told me the cameras won't work.
What do you make of that?
I don't know, because I have experienced my gear acting strangely at certain times where I really couldn't explain why, and I really needed it to work. I mean, I never saw like a full manifestation I was trying to photograph. Like, it wasn't in that type of situation. So I don't know. It's just part of the folklore. It's part of the story. It relates to all of these complications, and it's just part of the mystery.
Yeah. Or maybe we're to use all of our senses or other senses. Just like art, it's up to everybody's own interpretation.
Yes. Yes. And that's what I love about some of my spookier, more compelling pictures. I leave it open to the viewer to judge what is happening. I'm not trying to prove anything in my pictures, in the pictures that are in the book. I really love that you have to have the subjective interpretation of the viewer. Mm. And that's really how I try to leave them open-ended.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, this has been such a joy. Is there anything else you want to share about art and the invisible world of parapsychology?
I think I got to a lot of places today, and I thank you for this interview. I am such a huge super fan of this show and of you and of Jeff. So it's really a gift to be here, and I hope to come back and talk more sometime.
We would love to have you come back and talk more, and we are great fans of yours as well. Shannon Taggart, thank you so much for meeting with me here together in person in St. Paul and for being with me today.
Thank you.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.